Does the exchange rate tell you how strong the currency is and how much purchasing power you have in other countries? Well, let's take a look. So we've seen in the previous video the relationship between currencies, how you could find the actual exchange rate, and how that differs to what you see when you go to get your currency at a bank. Now we're going to look at the idea that if the US dollar, you can get more Canadian dollars per US dollar than parity, how that does not necessarily translate to the American dollar is stronger. Okay, if all of a sudden you go from parity to saying that one US dollar, instead of just counting for one Canadian dollar, gets $1.25, $1.40. Yes, the American currency is getting stronger. It's appreciating relative to the Canadian currency. That is true. But then to start off by saying, well, you can get more Canadian currency per US dollar, it must be stronger. They must have more purchasing power in Canada than we have there. That's false. Because otherwise, if you were to follow this logic, you would say, okay, here I look at one Canadian dollar gets you 0.72 US, therefore the Canadian dollar is weaker than the US. And then you could also say, well, with the same logic, let's just go to Europe. Okay, Canadian dollar is also weaker than the euro, therefore we can't buy as much when we travel there. And then you could think, well, okay, if let's say I'm planning to go on to Norway, and you say, ooh, in Norway, one Canadian dollar gets me 7.6 Norwegian kroner. Therefore, when I go there, I'm 100 Canadian dollars gets me like 700 of their currency. And thus, I must be able to buy a lot of coffees, pastries, and everything else over there with that amount of money. Well, that's completely false. If you've ever traveled to Norway, you'll realize that the actual cost of goods there is substantially higher than in Canada. And it means that your $100, what you can afford with $100 in Canada in terms of coffee, pastries, salmon, whatever, and you were to go to Norway and convert that $100 into their currency and try to buy, you wouldn't be able to buy as much. So here we could see clear disconnect between this idea. And then if you want to push it to the extreme and you go to Indonesia, here, if you look at one Canadian dollar gets you 12,000 of their currency. Well, in that respect, you would think, well, if the price is the same in both countries, well, buying one beer here is the equivalent of buying 12,000 beers over there. You could see how nonsensical that is quite rapidly. So to understand the relative price and the strength of a currency and purchasing power, you have to not only look at the exchange rate, but you have to look at the relative prices in different jurisdictions. And when you look at that into more detail, you're getting more into this concept of the real exchange rate that's looking at how much if you can afford one coffee here, how many coffees can you afford in this other country? If it's more than one, well, you have more purchasing power in that country than in your own in terms of coffee. If it's less than one, well, as soon as you sacrifice one coffee here, you're getting less than one over there. Therefore, your purchasing power is diminished for that specific good. So that's another concept that we're going to look at in the future. But I really want you guys to push aside this idea that if you can get more than one-to-one relationship with another currency, it means that you have greater purchasing power in your own country than the other country where you're getting more of that currency. That's false. You really have to consider the other things at the same time. Certain goods may be cheaper in Canada, relatively speaking, when we adjust for their currencies than in the States, but there's also goods that are cheaper in the States. So it's just something good to keep in mind. This is a very limited picture. Looking at this, we're getting 1.4, it means it's strong. No, but if we look at the chart that we looked at on the previous video, and I could just pop it back up here, the chart between Canada and the US, we can see over time, if prices haven't changed in the two countries, well, as the Canadian currency is appreciating recently, it means that we're able to buy more US product if prices haven't changed in both countries. But before then, there was a big downslope, which was our country was depreciating relative to theirs. So yes, in those instances, our country's currency is getting either weaker or stronger, which has an impact on purchasing power. But just saying 1 to 1 versus 1.4, it tells a whole picture that's completely false. Because at the end of the day, if you think of countries that have like hyperinflation problems, at one point, these countries' currency, they might have like these paper bills that will be like $1 million per paper bill at one point, because you're having to hoard so much paper bills to buy like a loaf of bread at the grocery store. They at some point they just say all of those paper bills are no longer in circulation. You're gonna need to use this new currency, and $1 of the new currency is equivalent to 10 million of the old currency. And as people switch that currency around, well, all of a sudden, that piece of paper, $1, is worth a lot more than it used to be. But at the same time, it doesn't change anything with respect to the world markets, because the markets would adjust to this change in denomination that you have in your own country. So hopefully you understand that seeing that 1 to 1 versus 1 to 1.4 is not the whole picture. Yes, going from 1.3 Canadian dollars to getting $1 to 1.4, the Canadian dollar is losing value relative to the US. The US is gaining value relative to the Canadian. That's true. But don't oversimplify it by saying their currency is worth more. They have greater purchasing power than us and everything. When they come here, everything's suddenly very cheap for them. That's false. Hopefully that clarifies things for you. Catch you guys in the next one. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing or joining my class, where I guide you to apply and expand on the information found in these videos to real life examples. Have a good day.